Bé, se sent? Sí? Bé, bona tarda, buenas tardes, good evening. It's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, our first keynote speaker for the Men in Movement Conference, Dr. Lucas Gottzén. Lucas Gottzén is professor in the Department of Child and Youth Studies at Stockholm University, Sweden. He takes feminist and critical perspectives on youth, gender, and sexuality, with a particular focus on young men and masculinities. Gottzen's current research primarily explores sex and pleasure, consent and sexual violence, the manosphere, online men's rights activism, and far-right extremism. He has authored numerous articles, edited volumes, and monographs, including the Routledge International Handbook of Masculinity Studies in 2020, Men, Masculinities, and Intimate Partner Violence in Routledge 2021. I cannot read this in Swedish, but I think it must be the sensitive type, at Macadam 2019, which explores the role of affect and gender in young and adult men's intimate partner violence. And he's also the author of Segueix-nos, Gender, with M. Erickson at Liber 2020, which is an introduction to feminist approaches to and critiques of the concept of gender. Gottzén is the founder and convener of the Masculinity, Masculinist Politics and Political Extremism Research Network, financed by North Forks. It is needless to say how happy I am and I feel to have you here today. Thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours. Many thanks.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Begoña. Es un placer estar aquí en Barcelona, en la Universidad de Oferta de Cataluña, y no solamente porque es un sitio, el grupo Medusa, Begoña y todo, ¿no? Pero también porque pasé bastante tiempo de mi infancia aquí en Barcelona. 5 años me crié aquí y bueno, tiene un parte de mi corazón. Bueno, lo resto va a ser en inglés porque mi castellano de trabajo no está bien. Bueno, pero las preguntas después podemos poner en castellano si quieras. So, today I'm going to talk about a concept that it's not my idea, but I have found to be useful to think about the far right, the manosphere, and far-right extremism. And tonight I'm going to talk more specifically in relationship to extremism and violent extremism. And the concept that I'm talking about is remasculinization. It might be obvious for some, but that most far-right extremists and terrorists are men. A very simple fact. But apparently this fact has not, until recently actually, or rather recently, been considered as particularly important in countering violent extremism efforts, or seen as psychologically or analytically important either in the mainstream research of the field, or fields maybe we should talk about. However, there's a growing body of research focusing on the link between men, masculinity, and the far right. And what's interesting with this field is that it shows basically that far-right groups and movements, despite that they can have very different political views on many different things, share remarkably similar concepts of masculinity. So basically, they commonly have conservative notions about men's place in the family, in society. They believe in there's an inherent difference between the sexes. They oppose feminism. They're critical of LGBTQ rights. And not least, they see political violence not only as a means to combat political opponents, but also to perform masculinity, I would say. So what I want to talk about tonight is to try to explore this link between far-right extremism, and particularly violent extremism, and masculinity through the concept of remasculinization. And what I argue with that is that, some scholars have pointed out that, for instance, that terrorism promises the individual terrorist restoration of a damaged masculinity. Others have argued that street-based militancy of different kinds could be a means to reclaim of status and power as a dominant hypermasculine man. So in both these cases, both the terrorist and the street violence, it has been argued basically that this is a way for the individual man, particularly the young man, to restore manhood in one way or another. What I argue is that, well, that's true, I think, in many cases, but what I would argue with my term remasculinization is something more, and that's basically that it's both the individual man, and this is the take-home message tonight, so it's both the individual man, it's a way for the individual man to deal with what we might call masculinity threats, and I will describe later on what I mean with that concept. But at the same time, it's a way for far-right politics. It's a strategy for far-right movements to recuperate what I would call white male supremacy. So that's my basic, and I will give you some examples in the second part of this lecture. So to start with remasculinization, what's interesting with that concept, it's not commonly used within far-right research, but has been used more within culture studies, history, and so on, from a gender or feminist perspective. So if we go back to the 19th century, and this is primarily Anglo literature, calls to recuperate manhood in society were recurrent, and particularly around what was at the time called the boy problem. And this is like in the US primarily, but also in the UK in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And at that time, the problem was considered to be industrialization, urbanization, feminization of the home and of the school, and non-WASP, non-white Aryan Protestants, basically, migration to the States. And that was associated with some sort of degeneration, and this was combined with ideas of eugenics, right? So an idea that the people, or the folk in German or in Swedish as well, are degenerated because of all these things happening. So we have to, and this, there was a particularly tied to ideas of and concerns of the nation and the army. So for instance, in the UK, it was tied to the idea of Great Britain, of the empire, and how to uphold that in different ways. And as an answer to that, they started to do different kinds of boy work. And one of them most famous still today would be the Boy Scouts. That was started by Baden-Powell. And this is a quote from Baden-Powell. Well, it says that we badly need some training for our lads if we are to keep up manliness in our race instead of lapsing into a nation of soft, sloppy cigarette suckers. So that was basically his argument of, we need to do something about this. And what was to do about that? So as a response, you had all these different groups doing boys' work or boyology, and Boy Scouts was one, YMCA was another one, and there was a bunch of different kinds, both in the States and the US, in the States and the UK. And generally, it was very much about building character and creating a quote-unquote manly boy. And this required a contact with nature and the outdoors, and it was kind of idealizing the pre-industrial rural wilderness, the frontier, and so on. It required homosociality, male bonding, and particularly that a bit older men or older young men was supposed to spend time with boys and be role models. And there were certain requirements of these male role models. They had to be ex-boys, so they had to think like boys and be able to communicate with teenage boys or even younger boys in different ways. And particularly, there was a need to do exercise, sports, lead a healthy lifestyle, and control sexuality in different kinds of ways. And this could be also sometimes connected, not in all these groups, of course, but sometimes connected with shooting, hunting, and developing what some would call warlike abilities. So if we turn to the 20th century, we had, basically I'm reliant on the studies that are actually discussing remasculinization in itself, so there's not a lot. But one important book is published by Jeffords, 1989, and she talks about the remasculinization of American culture. And basically her argument was that after the Vietnam War, the American culture underwent a process of remasculinization, and the Vietnam veteran became sort of the symbol of a fallen and emasculated American male. And they were seen as both victimized by both society and by the government in different ways. And Jeffords argues that this led basically to an increased demands for men's rights, sort of like a male identity politics in the US, but also the rise of men's rights movements, and in the long run also far-right movements, militias in the 80s and 90s. And similar processes have been identified in Germany and Japan, Chinese Americans. So what they argue, what this kind of literature argues, is that we find remasculinization more on a cultural level, that would be calls for American men to become more manly, whatever, or Swedish men or Spanish men, or Catalan men. So moving into focusing more specifically on the far right and far right extremism, and I'm going to leave the concept a bit right now, is that, as I said, they have very similar understandings of masculinity, and these tend to be tied to specific masculine positions where they are, kind of what my colleague of medicine would call core masculinities, or some would maybe call it hypermasculinity. But basically, men are warriors, they are protectors, they're breadwinners, kind of traditional traits in different ways. But more specifically, I think it's that they embrace not only white supremacy, the need for the white race or ethnicity to have privilege and still have privileges, but tie that together with men's privileges and male supremacy in different ways. So I would thereby call it a white male supremacy that combines both racism with masculinism and so on. And interestingly enough, while they see themselves as strong men and essentially, warriors and so on, they're also at the same time very much victims of society. So this is the more male identity politics part of it. So it's embracing a victimhood or resentment for culture becoming too feminized and too hateful against men, and particularly white men, and too much embracing women's rights, and also women having too much a say in society. And they're particularly blaming feminism. They're particularly blaming non-white men and the sexual revolution. And I'm going to give you a couple examples. For instance, the Norwegian white supremacist terrorist Anders Behring Breivik, that I think most of you have heard of, he argued in his manifesto that women dominate boys' upbringing. They create confused and directionless young men. And others argue that feminism has become too influential, threatens the traditional heterosexual family, undermines male privilege, all while women use feminism to promote their victimhood and align with other supposed victims to punish European men and demonize masculinity. And this is particularly shown in the logic or of the so-called Great Replacement. I don't know how much you're aware of that, but it's probably the most. It's a conspiracy theory, basically the idea that white people are exchanged and replaced by non-whites, and in the long run, depending on who you ask, but if you ask a Nazi, they would say, well, it's the Jews that do this. But basically they see that black and Muslim men are in one way or another a direct threat to white masculinity. They migrate to the Western societies, they compete for jobs, they have higher birth rates, and not least, they steal white women from white men. And finally, if we talk about the sexual revolution, then that's threatening, I would say, for two main reasons. First, women's increased sexual liberation and freedom, particularly through the contraceptive pills and other kinds of contraceptives, which has made sort of like in the long run the traditional male heterosexual family kind of redundant or at least optional. And also, which is we don't talk so much about, I would say the idea that pornography weakens Western civilizations and Western men. And this is through, and sometimes it's presented as a Jewish plot once again, by luring basically young white dudes who watch porn to be cuckolds, basically looking at and masturbating to interracial content, interracial sexual content, and that will basically diminish their virility and their desire to reproduce with white women. And that would also be a threat to white masculinity. So what far-right groups generally, and specifically on the more extreme side, would argue then that the only answer to this, or not the only, but the main answer to this would be to salvage, to save Western society, to save white masculinity, would be through a restored manhood, a restored masculinity. And this needs both is a need both in each individual white man, young man particularly, but also culturally or in the entire society. So if we go back then to, one of them basically, the arguments that I've read so far about remasculinization would be, for instance, then that radicalization would be a way to deal with social marginalization, of male failure, and the feelings of emasculization for the individual man. And involvement in the far right then could function as a way to restore sense of lost masculinity in one another. Or as another quote here, far-right extremism would be a reactionary rehabilitation of masculinity, and then, quote, at a time when the historical self-evidence of patriarchy is being challenged. And this is what you find in many groups. For instance, there's some research on this militia, the Proud Boys. I don't know if you know about them. They started 2016, around the same time as the first Men in Movement conference. They were not invited, but it's a men's movement. And it started as kind of a fight club, a brawling, men who wanted to be chauvinists, to drink and fight in different ways, and became actually as a group more and more radicalized, I would say, and ended up, they were one of the main militias that stormed the Capitol Hill now 4 years ago almost. And for the Proud Boys, violence is seen as a primary path to become a man. Violence becomes a way to achieve status, to defend oneself and one's masculinity, and an essential step in becoming a real man. let me turn to one of the people that have actually discussed these issues mostly, I would say, would be Michael Kimmel. He's a sociologist, US sociologist, and masculinity scholar. He's done interviews with ex-Nazis, part of them actually in Sweden, and part of them in the States, and with jihadists, former jihadists as well. And he doesn't talk about remasculinization so much explicitly in his book, Healing from Hate, from 2018, I think it is. But he talks quite a lot about radicalization and how that connects to masculinity. So I think his book is a good example to discuss masculinization and what I think are actually lacking in the literature and why we need another understanding of the concept, or we actually need the concept in one way or another. So basically his argument is that radicalization is not about ideological commitment, but about other stuff. So he says that young men don't get engaged in extremism for ideological reasons, but they seek camaraderie, the opportunity to fight, and a chance to prove themselves as men. He says they feel like failed men who need to prove their manhood, who need to feel like real men, but who are constantly thwarted. And in an earlier paper on the same data, actually on the Swedish data, I would say, he says, well, their commitments, these young men's commitments, were to a masculinizing project, not to national socialist ideology. So basically, he says that, well, they didn't get into the Nazi movement because they were Nazis. They got into the Nazi movement because they were trying to prove themselves as men. That's his argument. So instead of racism, he says, it is masculinity that becomes and this is a quote then, the psychological impetus for young men to join these groups and the social glue that holds them together, end of quote. And here's and he actually talked quite a lot about particularly young men then. And this is a bit longer quote from the book as well. The young men, that is the ex-Nazis, feel that an oppressive government has taken their masculinity from them. They are humiliated, shamed by their inability to succeed in the system. Yet they also feel entitled to the social goods that the state provides, and they see foreigners, immigrants, and others receiving those goods. They experience what I called aggrieved entitlement. That is a concept that he developed earlier on in the early 2010s, I think. And basically a sense of victimhood in being unable to get the economic and social benefits that are rightfully theirs. Their politics are therefore reactionary, nostalgic. They seek to restore and retrieve what they have lost. They look backward to create a vision of the future, back to a past that was purer and more responsive to their needs. So, since involvement in far-right extremism is not about actually, I would say also, before I go into that, is that this is not only, I mean, Michael Kimmel is doing this in relationship to gender, but there's mainstream scholars like that actually argue very similar things, that it's about psychological issues rather than political issues, why young men get involved in far-right extremism. So, and because of that, the response to far-right extremism to de-radicalize and counter-violent extremism efforts of different kinds should not be about focusing on ideology, but should be about helping, and this is a quote again from Kimmel, help young men feel like men, help them repair a sense of damaged manhood. Right. This is, in many ways, I kind of agree with this. I think it's important, but because, and particularly, I think it's kind of convincing argument that he has about how radicalization, but also de-radicalization, is not about only, at least, adopting extremist ideologies, the far-right ideologies and so on, and beliefs. But it's also about an issue of gender identity in one way or another. It's about being a young man or a man and being a man in the world and what it means to be a man. And in that sense, I think as a masculinity scholar myself, I think he has a good argument there. But I do think that there's some issues in his argument. First, I would say he takes this argument is about proving masculinity, and that comes from an older paper, an essay he wrote in the mid-90s, early 90s, where basically his argument is that masculinity is about proving yourself as a man towards other men. So it's a homosocial enactment, he would say. And that would be, and then basically he ties in and relates to psychoanalytical theories about shame, about trying to pose yourself as someone that you're not, and the fear of falling, a fear of being a fraud in one way or another. And that can lead to some sort of like exaggerated, hypermasculine, or whatever you want to call that, practices of different, for instance, violence. So he takes that concept, or that thinking, very much and moves into far-right extremism. And what happens is that he creates a divide between, on the one hand, masculinity, and masculinity here becomes like a psychological only, or maybe social psychological issue, or like an attribute, whereas politics and ideologies is something different. You follow me? So masculinity has, in his account, basically masculinity has nothing to do with politics or ideologies. So, and I would argue that it has everything to do with politics and ideologies in different kinds. And what happens when you create that distinction is that you can't really answer why do these young men move into far-right extremism to prove themselves as men instead of anywhere else, like gang-related violence or whatever. Is it just opportunity? It's just by chance then. And that, for me, makes it very difficult to actually understand radicalization. And also, and this is for the academics in the room, but I think he has a lot of methodological weaknesses. And part of it is because my awareness of actually the interviewees, or where he got his Swedish young men or former young men. Basically, he takes the interviewees, and this is for me coming from a constructivist discursive side. He argues that basically I would argue that he takes their motives for involvement at face value. So without considering that these could be, we follow, traditional sociological, culture studies, or, discursive perspectives. It's a vocabulary of motives or an account, etc., where you want to present yourself as a good man. So why were you a Nazi? Like, I was young and dumb, You would not answer, well, I was really a racist, and I was committed racist, and therefore I moved into Nazism, or whatever. And also there's a meta-narrative, I would say, like an institutional, organizational narrative here. Like these exit programs, these kind of programs for having radical or extremists moving out of extremism, both jihadism and particularly neo-Nazi, at least the Swedish ones that I know of, they tend to emphasize development and identity, that kind of issues, instead of ideology. So, and what he doesn't really reflect on is that what I would say, it's much easier to recognize, as I said, that you're immature as a youngster, and admitting that you've done that and that led me to the wrong path or whatever, than actually saying that you're committed to the National Socialist movement or whatever. And just because being young and dumb, you could actually distance yourself from that and saying, well, that was then, now have matured. Whereas far-right extremist ideologies of different kinds, it's more difficult to distance yourself from that. And he actually never discusses that, how they have moved on or not. Basically, de-radicalization for him becomes they are not involved in the Nazi skin movement anymore, basically. They've grown out their hair. Nothing about their ideological ideas today. So what I want to do is that I want to use that idea, which I think is helpful still, but not take at face value certain things, and particularly not distinguishing too much between politics or ideologies and gender identity, but actually seeing them as one thing, or at least jointly together. And one way to do that would be through a concept, originally a psychological concept called masculinity threat or gender threat, which some scholars have moved into political sciences to explain basically what we're seeing around the world today, that men are moving and voting more, and particularly white men are voting more right-wing on far-right parties, but also generally more right-wing than women. And basically what Ben and Bess and Casino are arguing is that masculinity threat would be then a sense of that your privilege as a man are threatened by different things, but primarily then by feminism, non-whites, and so on. And that leads you to kind of become more conservative in ways. So that's their argument. And I would say that remasculinization would be then a response or an answer, an attempt to answer masculinity threats. And as my colleague Sune Kvottrup Jensen, who's done quite a lot of studies on jihadist extremism of different kinds, this concept is very much developed in dialogue with him, I would say. He sees it as a process that operates both on a discursive and a social material level, basically. It's discursive in the sense that it's ideological, it's kind of a way to talk about men in different ways. It's also that these movements, and this is particularly the issue of jihadist movements, he would argue, that it provides men with social, material, and also discursive resources to be able to perform masculinity in one way, to prove themselves as men. So, at the time of ISIS, for instance, Western Muslim men moved to Syria, to the Caliphate, and there they got, they went from being unemployed or being living in a racist societies to got a gun, money, women, etc., and social status in a different way. So that would be one way to talk about that kind of remasculinization process on a social material level. So what I would say then, that political violence of different kinds could be employed to regain, not always, but could be employed to regain a status of being a masculine man. But it's also a way to maintain or restore white men's dominance and power generally. It works both on an individual, social level, but also on a cultural, social level at the same time, often simultaneously. So it's both individual and a political strategy in different ways then. And this will differ in different environments, I would say, depending on a bunch of different issues. But I would give you 5 arenas or means of remasculinization that I want to share with you that I think are basically things or practices within the far right that are that one could study through this prism. So, for instance, violence on an individual level, it's a performance of masculinity, sometimes of what some would call hypermasculinity. But it's also about using violence, of course, against perceived enemies, against non-whites and so on. And in the long run, then defending the nation or the race, the white race, against threats of different kinds. So you see, it's both individual, but it's also political strategy. If you take the body, I'm not sure if I would call this the body, but let's use the concept of the body, which lately have become more and more important for, important for the far right. So sports, hiking, healthy lifestyles of healthy eating, not drinking, for instance, alcohol, are kind of things that are important and seen as important in the movements in different ways. And of course, there are individual benefits of health, of mental health, and so on, of getting a fitter body and so on. It's also a recruitment tool right now, and a way to develop fit, healthy bodies that are ready to fight, that are ready to for street-based militancy. And this is, this is an old fascist aesthetics that we find a long time ago, World War II and so on. The third area or means of remasculinization regards or relates to sexuality. So as I mentioned, pornography is seen as one of the main evils. So controlling masturbation for young men, not wanking, no fap, and so on, would be a way for the young person to, of course, overcome a sense of getting stuck in front of the screen, of being addicted to porn and so on, and get rid of pornography consumption, and would hopefully then lead to a heterosexual relationship or make heterosexual sex actually better, to perform better, because it's a lot about having a hard-on or not. So it gives the individual man, or promises to give the individual man, mental health and mental strength, but also is a way to reproduce the white race, aka the great replacement, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, I have two final ones. The one is women, and of course women are, far-right extremism and remasculinization is all about women, basically. Women have taken too much power, or have too much power, they're too much to say, feminism is to blame, and so on. And basically this is about restoring not only like male supremacy globally, or like in a society, but it's also restoring what we could call private patriarchy, the man who decides in the family. And finally, this is also then about homosexuality. So it's about individual men can become more masculine only if they're in community with other men. And this, again, refers back to even after World War I, when you had the Freikorps, I think it's the right concept in German, basically different militias moving around in Germany and Austria and so on. And there they have the ideal of the Männerbund, basically la comunidad de varones o algo así, ¿no? And that was kind of where women were not welcomed, and actually, they have big issues with women in different ways. And maybe it's not always as extreme in these environments, but basically the recurrent argument is that that young men particularly are confused today, and they need proper male role models to help them in different ways.
I think now it's time to close this event for today, but we'll be here tomorrow, 10:30. Hopefully we will meet here again. So have a nice night, and thanks for coming. Thank you very much,
Gracias.
Lucas.
Thanks. Yeah.